What kind of child throws hot coffee at a man in a $5,000 suit and doesn't even flinch? The question seemed to hang in the air before anyone dared to say it out loud, because in that moment, inside a polished downtown Chicago cafe where marble floors reflected soft amber light and every whisper carried weight, something had gone terribly wrong. The cup slipped from small fingers. No, not slipped, deliberately tipped, sending a wave of steaming coffee across the chest of Ethan Caldwell, a man whose presence alone usually silenced rooms before he even spoke. The liquid soaked into fine fabric, darkening the crisp lines of his tailored jacket. A slow spread like ink across power itself. Gasps broke out, sharp and scattered, chairs scraping faintly as people leaned back, instinctively creating distance from a scene they already knew would end badly. Phones appeared in hands. Eyes widened. Someone muttered, "That's him." But no one finished the sentence, because everyone knew who he was without needing to say it. And yet, the most unsettling part wasn't what had happened. It was what didn't. Ethan Caldwell didn't move. Not an inch.
No shout. No sudden motion.
No anger flashing across his face. He simply stood there, coffee dripping from the edge of his sleeve. His stillness louder than any reaction could have been. The kind of stillness that made people hold their breath without realizing it. Across from him stood Amara Brooks, 8 years old, small enough that the edge of the table nearly reached her chest, her dark eyes lifted toward him. Not pleading, not panicked, but steady in a way that didn't belong to someone her age. Around her, the world began to close in. A manager rushed forward, his voice rising too quickly, too loudly, grabbing her wrist as if control could undo what had already been done. "Are you out of your mind?" he snapped, his grip tightening just enough to draw attention. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" A few customers shook their heads, already judging, already deciding. A child from nowhere, dressed too simply for a place like this, standing in front of a man whose time alone was worth more than most people's lives. The imbalance was obvious, crushing. And still, Amara didn't apologize, didn't pull away, didn't cry. She just kept looking at Ethan Caldwell as if waiting for something only she understood. Behind him, 2 men in dark suits shifted forward, their movements subtle but precise, the kind of men who didn't ask questions before acting. The air tightened. The cafe moments ago filled with soft conversation and clinking cups now felt like a stage frozen mid-scene. Then Ethan lifted one hand, just slightly.
No sudden motion.
No force. But it was enough. The men stopped instantly. The manager's voice faltered. Even the quiet hum of the espresso machine seemed to fade into the background. And for the first time since the coffee touched his skin, Ethan Caldwell lowered his gaze to meet the girls. Not with rage, not with dismissal, but with something far more dangerous. He studied her. And the room, watching closely, began to realize this wasn't over. Not even close. How long does it take for a crowd to turn on a child? The answer unfolded in seconds, sharp and unforgiving, as whispers thickened into judgment and judgment hardened into certainty. The manager's grip tightened around Amara Brooks' wrist, pulling her slightly forward as if presenting evidence of a crime no one needed explained. "You think this is funny?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the silence, louder now that fear had found a target. "Do you even know who you just did that to?" Amara didn't respond. Her small hand remained limp in his grasp, her shoulders steady, her gaze still fixed on Ethan Caldwell as if everything else in the room had already disappeared. Around them, customers leaned in, not to help, not to understand, but to witness. Phones angled higher, capturing the moment from every side, because scenes like this didn't happen every day. And when they did, people wanted proof they were there. A woman near the window shook her head, murmuring, "Parents these days," while a man in a navy suit muttered something about no respect anymore. The narrative had already been written, and Amara had been cast as the problem. The manager exhaled sharply, his patience gone, his authority swelling now that the room seemed to support him. "That's it," he said, turning slightly toward the counter. "I'm calling the police. You can explain it to them." The word police landed heavier than the coffee ever could. A few people shifted uncomfortably, but no one stepped in. because stepping in meant risk. And risk was something people like them avoided at all costs. Still, Amara didn't resist, didn't plead, didn't even glance at the manager. She only watched Ethan Caldwell, as if the decision that mattered most had nothing to do with anyone else. That quiet defiance unsettled more than any outburst could have. It didn't fit. It didn't make sense. And that made it dangerous in a way no one could quite explain. The manager followed her gaze, finally turning his attention back to the man at the center of it all. "Sir, I'm so sorry," he said quickly, his tone shifting into something almost desperate. "We'll handle this immediately. This won't reflect on our establishment, I promise." But Ethan didn't answer. Not right away. He remained exactly where he was, coffee still darkening his sleeve, his posture unchanged, his expression unreadable. The apology hung in the air, unanswered, like everything else in that moment. The manager hesitated, unsure whether to continue or retreat, his confidence cracking just enough to show through, because this wasn't how these situations usually went. There was supposed to be anger, a demand, a reaction that gave everyone clear direction. Instead, there was only silence. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, Ethan shifted his gaze. Not to the manager, not to the crowd, but back to Amara. The room seemed to hold its breath again. Even the people recording felt it, though they didn't lower their phones. Something was about to happen. Not loud, not explosive, but definitive. The kind of moment that changed how a story would be told from that point forward. And somehow, impossibly, it all depended on a man who hadn't said a single word, and a girl who hadn't taken her eyes off him. What kind of child warns a man with her eyes before she ever speaks? The question didn't form in words, not yet, but it moved through Ethan Caldwell's mind like a quiet disturbance, something out of place in a world he had spent years controlling down to the smallest detail. He had seen fear before thousands of times in boardrooms on quiet streets, in the flicker of hesitation when people realized exactly who they were dealing with. Fear had a pattern. It trembled. It avoided eye contact. It apologized before anything was even said. But Amara Brooks did none of those things. She stood there, her small frame held steady in the manager's grip, her eyes locked onto his with a focus that felt intentional, not defiant, not reckless, intentional. That was what made it different. That was what made it dangerous. Around them, the tension stretched thin, like glass waiting to crack. The manager shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable now that Ethan hadn't responded the way he expected. "Sir, we'll take care of this immediately," he repeated, softer this time, as if lowering his voice might somehow restore control. "She'll be removed from the premises." Removed. The word lingered. Final. Dismissive. Ethan's gaze didn't leave Amara. Not even for a second. Behind him, one of his men leaned in slightly, just enough for only him to hear. "Say the word," the man murmured, calm, efficient, already anticipating the outcome. That was how it always worked. A signal. A decision. Problem erased. Ethan didn't respond. Not to his man. Not to the manager. Not to the room. Because something about this didn't align. His instincts, sharp, honed, rarely wrong, weren't reacting to the act itself. They were reacting to her. The way she stood. The way she didn't pull away. The way her breathing remained even, as if she had already accepted whatever came next. That wasn't bravery. Not exactly. It was something older. Something learned. Slowly, deliberately, Ethan stepped forward. The movement was minimal, but it carried weight. The manager instinctively loosened his grip, just slightly, as if proximity alone demanded it. Ethan lowered himself, not fully kneeling, but enough to bring his line of sight closer to hers. The cafe seemed to shrink around them, the distance between power and vulnerability collapsing into a single, fragile moment. Up close, he could see it more clearly now. Not fear, not regret. Something else lived in those eyes. Something that didn't belong in a child's expression. "Look at me," he said quietly. Not a command. Not quite a request. More like a test. Amara didn't hesitate. She was already looking. and she didn't look away. The manager swallowed, uncertain now, his earlier confidence dissolving into something closer to unease. The people recording shifted their phones, zooming in, sensing that this wasn't going to unfold the way they expected. Ethan studied her face, searching for the reason behind the act, for the moment that triggered it, for the flaw in the pattern that would make everything make sense again. But there was no flaw, only intention. And then, just as the silence stretched to its breaking point, Amara's lips parted slightly. Not to apologize, not to explain, but to say something that would change everything. And in that instant, before a single word was spoken, Ethan Caldwell understood one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't an accident. And whatever came next, the room wasn't ready for it. What if the thing everyone thought was an attack was actually a warning? The words didn't come loudly, didn't echo across the cafe. But when Amara Brooks finally spoke, they cut through the tension with a precision that silenced even the quietest whispers. You weren't supposed to drink that. Her voice was soft, almost too soft for a room filled with marble and murmurs, but Ethan Caldwell heard every syllable as if the world had narrowed down to just the two of them. For a fraction of a second, nothing moved. Not the manager, not the customers, not even the phones still raised in the air. The sentence didn't fit the scene. It didn't match the narrative everyone had already decided on. And that was exactly why it mattered. Ethan's gaze shifted, slow and deliberate, from Amara's eyes to the untouched cup sitting on the table beside him. Steam still curled faintly from its surface, innocent in appearance, ordinary in every way. Yet now it no longer felt harmless. The manager blinked, confused, trying to catch up. What is she talking about? He asked, his voice uncertain for the first time. But Ethan didn't answer. His attention had already moved beyond the obvious. He followed the direction Amara's eyes flickered toward. Just for a second, but it was enough. A man near the exit. Mid-40s, average build, forgettable in the way that made people invisible in crowded spaces. He was walking out too quickly, not running, not drawing attention, but just fast enough to suggest urgency. That was all Ethan needed. He didn't raise his voice, didn't create a scene, just a subtle shift of his fingers, barely noticeable to anyone else. But to the men behind him, it was a command as clear as any spoken word. They moved instantly, smooth and controlled, intercepting the man before he reached the door. Conversations died completely now. Every head turned. The cafe, once a place of quiet luxury, had transformed into something else entirely. Something sharper, colder, waiting. The manager stepped back, releasing Amara's wrist without realizing it, his earlier authority dissolving into confusion. Sir, is there a problem? He asked, but even he seemed unsure whether he wanted an answer. Ethan didn't respond. He was watching, always watching. Across the room, his men guided the man back inside, not forcefully, not dramatically, but with a firmness that left no room for resistance. The man's expression had changed subtly, but enough. The calm was gone, replaced by something tighter, calculated, and just beneath that, fear. Ethan's eyes flicked once more to the coffee, then back to Amara. The connection locked into place. Not fully, not yet, but enough to shift everything. He straightened slowly, the damp fabric of his jacket now forgotten, irrelevant compared to what was unfolding. Stay here, he said quietly, though it wasn't clear whether he was speaking to Amara, to the manager, or to the room itself. No one moved anyway, because now, for the first time since the coffee spilled, the question had changed. It was no longer about what the girl had done. It was about why. And as Ethan Caldwell stood there, watching the pieces fall into place, one thing became impossible to ignore. The child they had all judged might be the only reason he was still standing. What if the only person who understood the danger was the one everyone ignored? The cafe didn't erupt into chaos. Not yet. But something quieter and far more unsettling took its place. A shift. A hesitation that spread from table to table as people began to realize they might have judged too quickly. Ethan Caldwell stood motionless, his eyes no longer on the man being held near the door, but on the cup that still sat untouched beside him. Steam curled upward in thin, fading strands, as ordinary as any drink ordered on a Tuesday afternoon. And yet nothing about it felt ordinary anymore. Across the room, his men had already done what they were trained to do: contain, observe, control. The man they stopped didn't struggle. That was the first sign. He didn't argue, didn't protest loudly like an innocent person might. He just stood there, his jaw tight, his eyes moving too carefully, as if calculating something that had already gone wrong. One of Ethan's men reached into the man's jacket. Not aggressively, not dramatically, but with practiced precision, and pulled out something small enough to fit in the palm of his hand. It wasn't obvious. Not at first glance. But it didn't need to be. Ethan saw it from across the room, and that was enough. A faint flicker passed through his expression, so brief most people missed it. But it was there. Recognition. Not of the object itself, but of what it meant. The manager, still standing near Amara Brooks, blinked rapidly, trying to process what was unfolding. "Sir, I don't understand," he said, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier confidence. No one answered him, because this wasn't a moment for explanations. This was a moment for realization. The room, once filled with quiet judgment, now held something else entirely: uncertainty. The same people who had shaken their heads moments ago were now lowering their phones, their certainty dissolving into confusion. A woman near the counter leaned closer to her companion and whispered, "Wait, what's happening?" But the question didn't need to be answered out loud. It was already being answered in silence. Ethan finally moved. Not quickly, not urgently, but with
Intention.
He reached for the cup, not to drink, not even to lift it fully, but just enough to study it more closely. His fingers paused at the edge, as if the space between touch and contact held all the meaning in the world. Then he stopped, because he didn't need to go any further. His gaze shifted again back to Amara. She hadn't moved, not even when the tension shifted, not even when the man was stopped. She stood exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her eyes still watching him with that same quiet certainty, as if she had already known how this would unfold. And in that moment, the truth settled into place. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with a weight that pressed into every corner of the room. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a child acting out. This was a decision. A calculated, risky, impossible decision made by someone no one thought capable of making it. Ethan exhaled slowly, the first real sign that something inside him had shifted. Not anger, not relief, something deeper. Because now the question wasn't whether she had done something wrong. It was why she had done something right, and how she had known to do it at all. And as the cafe stood frozen in that fragile realization, one thing became impossible to ignore. The smallest person in the room had seen what no one else had. And for the first time, Ethan Caldwell wasn't the one in control of the moment. She was. In a quiet luxury cafe in downtown Chicago, a powerful mafia boss is unexpectedly confronted by a moment that challenges everything he represents when a little black girl deliberately spills hot coffee on him, shocking everyone present and triggering a chain of events that no one saw coming. What begins as public humiliation quickly transforms into a gripping narrative of power, perception, and hidden truth as the room watches the imbalance between absolute authority and vulnerable innocence unfold in real time. This story blends emotional tension with cinematic storytelling, capturing the essence of dark romance through silence, eye contact, and unspoken understanding, where the boss's stillness becomes more terrifying than anger and the child's calm defiance hints at something far deeper. As suspicion replaces judgment, the audience is drawn into a layered experience of dark romance where danger and empathy collide, revealing that not all actions are what they seem and not all heroes look powerful. The little black girl, underestimated by everyone around her, becomes the center of a moral shift that forces the mafia boss to question instinct, control, and the consequences of his world, creating a compelling arc of dark romance that is not about love in the traditional sense, but about recognition, protection, and transformation. This emotionally charged encounter explores the boundaries between fear and respect, where a single moment redefines power and dignity, and where the quiet courage of a child reshapes the perception of a man feared by many. As the tension builds and the truth slowly surfaces, viewers are immersed in a narrative that balances suspense and humanity, delivering a powerful dark romance experience that resonates beyond the scene itself. The contrast between wealth and vulnerability, authority and innocence, creates a story that is both visually rich and emotionally profound, making it a standout example of dark romance storytelling that captivates audiences and leaves a lasting impression. Ultimately, this is a story about perception, consequence, and the unexpected ways dignity can rise in the face of overwhelming power, proving that even in the most controlled environments, a single act can shift everything. What kind of child recognizes danger, not from what she sees, but from what she remembers? The question lingered quietly in Ethan Caldwell's mind as the cafe stood suspended in a fragile silence, the kind that follows a truth no one was prepared to face. His men remained near the restrained stranger, their presence firm but controlled, while the rest of the room struggled to make sense of a moment that had shifted too quickly for comfort. But Ethan wasn't looking at them anymore. His attention had narrowed completely onto Amara Brooks. There was something in her stillness now that felt heavier than before. Not just confidence, not just intention, but memory. And memory in his world was never harmless. He took a slow step closer, closing the distance between them until the noise of the cafe seemed to fade into something distant and irrelevant. Up close, he could see it more clearly now. The steadiness in her eyes wasn't natural for someone her age. It was practiced, learned, earned. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice low, controlled, carrying none of the authority people expected from him, but something else entirely. Curiosity edged with caution. Amara didn't answer right away. Her gaze flickered, just briefly, not away from him, but inward, as if searching for something she wasn't sure she wanted to say out loud. The manager shifted awkwardly nearby, unsure whether he was still part of this situation or completely irrelevant now. No one else spoke. No one interrupted, because whatever was happening between this man and this child had moved beyond public spectacle. It had become something private, even in a room full of witnesses. Finally, Amara spoke, her voice quiet but clear enough to cut through the silence. "He used his left hand," she said. The words were simple, almost meaningless to anyone else, but not to Ethan. Something in his expression changed, subtle, controlled, but unmistakable to anyone paying close attention. Not shock, not yet, recognition. "That's how they do it," she continued, her tone steady, as if explaining something obvious. "They don't want people to notice." The room didn't understand, but Ethan did, because in his world, details like that weren't random. They were signatures, patterns, methods that told stories without needing words. He felt it then, a small, almost imperceptible shift inside himself. Not fear, not guilt, just awareness, the kind that crept in slowly, forcing connections he hadn't yet allowed himself to make. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, softer now. And this time Amara didn't hesitate. "My dad," she said. The words landed differently, heavier. The simplicity of them made them harder to ignore. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, though he didn't break eye contact. Around them, the cafe remained frozen, the people inside now fully aware that they were witnessing something far more significant than an accident or a misunderstanding. "What about your dad?" he asked, and for the first time since this began, something in Amara's expression shifted. Not into fear, not into sadness, but into something quieter, something that carried weight without needing tears. "He said to watch hands," she replied. "Said people show who they are without meaning to." Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath measured, controlled, but carrying something new beneath it, because now the pieces weren't just forming a picture. They were forming a connection, and connections in his world were never simple. They led somewhere, always. He glanced briefly toward the man being held near the door, then back to Amara. The pattern was too familiar, too precise, and suddenly, This moment wasn't just about what had almost happened. It was about what had already happened before. Somewhere else. To someone else. And as Ethan Caldwell stood there, looking down at a child who had just saved his life without ever raising her voice, one realization settled in with quiet certainty. This wasn't the first time she had seen something like this. And that meant the story didn't start here. Not for her. Not even close.